So, to confirm prejudices, we start punctually. A great pleasure and great honor to have Marco Butti here, who is Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs of the EU Commission, and one of those Europeans who have been thinking about how to make the monetary union resilient and viable for a very long time. He's in particular been working at the interface of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and has been writing lots of papers. So we assign here many of his papers to students. He's in particular also been following up very intensely what has been going on in the crisis. So you can read from Marco and collaborators, in particular on the EU Vox page, rather regularly, explaining what Europe should do, what Europe is about to do, and writing about scenarios on Europe. Marco has been not only writing non-papers, but also is the chief architect of this white paper of the EU Commission published in March on the future of Europe. Incidentally, it was criticized by the German authorities before it was published, which is a good behavior, I would suppose. And it comes with a number of reflection papers. So one of those is Deepening of the Economic and Monetary Union, which was published in May. Marco is a good friend of mine whom I know for a very long time, and I pulled myself out of discussing him because that would be really too boring. I would be mainly applauding probably what he is about to say. Hence we hired our own Peter Hall, who doesn't need any introduction, who is a
He's getting his usual rate for this, which you might imagine is 0.
Who is a Europhile and hence frustrated about what is going on in Europe. So without further ado, I would like to have Marco giving his presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Hans Helmut. Great pleasure to be here. Okay, I have my slides. No, before coming here, I fished back what I presented last year, exactly 1 year ago. So I have the Halloween rendezvous in Boston. And the title last year was An Easy Calm, Fixing Europe's Economic and Institutional Woes. And I was looking through the slides, and actually there is I talk about the policy debate at the time, and also the economic situation and outlook. And I had a slide here: will recovery continue? And high uncertainty, extremely high actually. Risks have intensified in recent months. You had the external risks. This was before what we know happened on this side of the Atlantic. It was actually a week before the events. And then on the domestic risks, also reforms delayed, NPL, banking problems, and the impact of Brexit, obviously. On the Brexit side, emphasizing not only the potential economic fallout, but also the political externalities. At the time, it was not really clear whether there would not be a knock-on effect, potentially inspiring other countries to go the same way. Now, if we fast forward from then to today, I think we are clearly in an environment which is objectively much more favorable. I mean, the recovery has continued and has accelerated. In the definition of Mario Draghi, has become much more robust and broad-based. Actually, they have switched from the recovery to expansion, actually be sufficiently robust. We just published, I think now with the jet lag, I think it was yesterday, our latest indicator, business consumer indicator, the economic sentiment indicators, which continue to go up quite strongly. So the overall environment on the economic side being, I think, more favorable, definitely much more favorable than last year. And on the political side, we have, you know, after the EU election cycle, which if one looks at with a certain, you know, certain attention, shows that certainly with a number of nuances, obviously, but I think overall, even though the populist threats are clearly still there, there has not been yet a situation in which the populists have, you know, won outright in elections, European countries. So this is the overall environment. What I'm going to do with this is to look at the 16-17. I have already anticipated a bit some of the conclusions. Economic recovery with crisis legacies. And then moving forward to completing EMU, and then embedding the EMU debate and the EMU completion into the new European public goods. So this is the plan. Now on the first one, okay. It does not seem to move. No, I got a bit stuck here. Okay. Okay, here. Okay, fine. Okay, okay, at least the first is okay, fine. The first on the first one. Okay, I mentioned it before. Huge economic and political uncertainty last year, and you know, risks of you know, populist threats clearly imminent. If one looks at what has happened in the past 12 months, we can see that we had the elections in Netherlands. We had two runs actually in Austria. The first, the presidential elections, and then we had lately the parliamentary elections, and then France and Germany. After the first three there, we moved from depression to euphoria, with the idea that you know, now we have the wind in our sails, as the President of the Commission said, also on the political viewpoint, and this would allow to make a major breakthrough in the European project in general, and economic and monetary union in particular. And then we had the result of the election in Germany. You have seen that Mrs. Merkel being reinstated as chancellor, but clearly with let's say, in a weaker position, and with a potential majority, the so-called Jamaica coalition, which is not necessarily particularly friendly from the economic, from the European viewpoint. At least this is how main commentaries sees the result of the elections. And we are, we have moved then from euphoria to depression again. So I would suggest to apply Hodri Presto filter to this euphoria and depression, and try to look in a more moderate and objective way at the situation. Is a more inward-looking Germany and compelling outcome of the latest elections? I mean, my answer is not necessarily so. Okay, first of all, and we are going to look at it later, I mean, we have been complaining quite a lot over the past years of, let's say, depressed domestic demand in Germany. I think this is, by the way, not the situation anymore. Now the German growth, which remains robust, is actually pretty, it's driven by essentially by domestic demand. But if one looks forward at the potential outcome of the coalition discussions, I think a safe prediction is that there will be a fiscal boost. I think on the revenue side, I think the reduction in taxes demanded by the liberals, and on the spending side, I think more public investment, which is, I think, widely acknowledged as being necessary in Germany, especially in infrastructure. So from that viewpoint, I think we can expect more domestic demand in Germany. So, and this helping to rebalance the adjustment within the Eurozone. And the second point is that a more inward look in Germany would imply that the problems which have been highlighted by the support for Alternative for Deutschland, which is the extreme right party, which gained almost 30%, 12.6% of the vote, would actually be solved by Germany alone. But if you relate the concerns of voters for the Alternative for Deutschland to issues like security or migration, I think it is quite safe to predict that you will need a European solution there in order to tackle these problems in earnest. So the issue here will remain on the completion of economic and monetary union, and to what extent there will be sufficient, let's say, determination and a breakthrough in economic and monetary union matters. This is less evident. I think the fact that Macron, having won the elections in France on an explicit pro-European agenda, including the completion of EMU's architecture, I think it would be much more difficult for Germany, as they did in the case of Hollande 5 years ago, to simply refuse this or to propose a small deal which would satisfy the new French president. I think there will be a number of conditions to be satisfied in terms of risk reduction in order to proceed to risk more risk sharing. I think that is something that one should not bury necessarily in advance. There is an Eastern European issue, clearly, beside the Euro area matters, with the rise of illiberal democracies, especially in Poland and Hungary. I think there is this is something we have to take very seriously. The President of the Commission in the State of the Union speech put forward an agenda for the 27, so the 28 minus the UK, to the horizon 2025, seeing the joining the euro by most of the member states currently outside the eurozone has been the horizon and the orientation. At the same time, I think if the discussion continues and with difficult political political conditions in these countries, we may actually see the two-speed Europe being on the horizon here. We are clearly working for having the 27 together, but politically that may not be something that is in the cards immediately. We are going to see this in the discussion on the new multi-annual financial perspectives of the EU budget over the next years. What populists have in common is to be against Europe, and I think this is you can rationalize that whether you take a perspective which is an economic interpretation of populism or a more cultural identitarian interpretation. I think we will need to fight back quite strongly on this. Here there are two ways forward. One is to steal the clothes of populists and try to pursue their agenda. This is not what Macron has done, and I think a more proactive offensive, as the new president of France has done, is the right response to the populist threats. So this is a bit the panorama that we have after the election cycle, recalling that the election cycle is not complete because we are going to have in front of us, I think, next spring, the Italian elections, which are clearly not evident in terms of the final results. Now, okay. What is interesting to note, and many of you have seen it, is that in spite of the fact that the euro area has gone through an existential crisis over the past several years, the support for the euro has always remained stable and actually very high. I have the latest figures for the Eurobarometer, flash Eurobarometer. I think it's going to be published these days. We have an all-high support for the euro. We have 74% of the respondents saying that the euro is good for the EU, which is plus 8 percentage points compared to last year, and 64% that the euro is good for your own country, which is 7 percentage points more. So I think this is an element of confidence that one should also politically bank on. Now, if we move to the, this is always a little bit slow. Okay, I mentioned the recovery, which is taking hold. What is, I think, notable, okay, first of all, is that we are basically 2 years after the US, but now we are actually growing stronger than the US. And interesting, and this is the graph on the right-hand side, the cohesion of the recovery has increased quite substantially over the past quarters. So we are seeing not only countries in the core of Europe growing, but also countries which were hit more strongly by the crisis in the years 2011, 2012, 2013, which is the most worrying moment of the euro area crisis, which has started to grow again and grow pretty strongly. So the standard deviation around the euro area average is actually much smaller than it has ever been before. So the broad-based nature of the recovery is there, and this is pretty comforting. Nonetheless, and this is the assessment that we have still, we are going to publish our forecast at the beginning of November, but 8th of November, but this is still, I think, the assessment that we have now, and I think we will have at the time. Strong recovery, more broad-based, but not yet complete. If one looks at the 4 indicators that I have presented here, try to capture a bit the state of the economic recovery, which is the investment gap, which is the y-axis on the top. Here I take the investment to GDP ratio now compared to the long-term investment to GDP ratio, that's I star. And here I'm not taking I star 2008, where we may have been experiencing a irrational exuberance and overinvestment, but you take the long term, we are still 1.5 percentage points of GDP lower now. If you take labor market slack, also, even though the labor market has done actually pretty well, we still have a gap compared to the pre-crisis period. If you take definitions of unemployment like the EU6, which is a broader one compared to the standard definition of unemployment, we are still 4 percentage points, around 4 percentage points low, higher slack compared to the higher unemployment in this broad definition than before the crisis. Persistently low inflation and a large current account surplus, about 3% of GDP surplus, which may be an indication of subdued domestic demand. So this is a bit why the recovery is still not complete. And I have put in the little boxes some of the let's say indications of what kind of economic dynamics you may have out of this these gaps should they not be filled. And the conditions of financial fragility have not been overcome fully. If one looks at public debt, if you look at non-performing loans, budget deficits, still long-term interest rates, you can see that compared to Germany, actually you still have quite a bit of financial fragility that will have to be addressed in the present circumstances in the near future. What we need to do is to have an adjustment within the euro area, which is more symmetric that we had in the past year. We have 3 percentage points plus current account surplus of the euro area as a whole. This is basically due to the fact that the Netherlands and Germany have kept and even increased over the past years their current account surplus, and the other countries which started from a deficit, we actually moved into surplus. So we had overall an asymmetric adjustment within the Eurozone. And even countries like Italy, you have Spain, Portugal, I don't have it here, but they have all moved into current account surplus. France is not the case. So I have tried to picture here in a bit of an imaginative way through the Swan graph, the internal and external equilibrium. So we have the combination of current account deficit or surplus and the output gap positive and negative, and see a bit what kind of directions these countries should take in order to move to a more balanced adjustment within the Eurozone. You have Italy, which currently has a current account surplus and still a negative output gap, which should move towards the equilibrium. So with recovery still needing to accelerate, I think France has to regain competitiveness whilst correcting the negative output gap. And what is particularly important is you can see here for the Netherlands and Germany, which are by and large have an internal equilibrium. If you look at basically labor market is full employment. One can discuss obviously on social conditions, inequality, etc. But overall, the economy is operating at around potential, which have nonetheless a very large current account surplus. Actually, the two countries combined, they have a current account surplus which is considerably larger than China, for instance, at the global level. So you can see that there is a need to correct this, and the path towards equilibrium here would probably need to go towards conditions of positive output gap, which would boost wages and inflation. This will allow to reduce the current account surplus, boost demand, but also help change the relative price within the Eurozone between countries in surplus and countries in deficit. So the economic policy that we have to put in place, I think, will have to be consistent with achieving this type of adjustment within the Eurozone. Now, if we move forward towards completing economic and monetary union, we are the debate is basically, let me say, polarized here around two competing views. And our approach and our task is to create the bridge between the two positions, and that's what we have tried to do or sketch out in the reflection paper that Hans Helmut mentioned that we published last May, reflection paper on EMU. I mean, the first view is basically the back to Maastricht approach. No prize to guess who would support this type of position. I think basically it's stronger enforcement of EU rules, strong accent on deficit and debt, in particular on debt now. The macroeconomic imbalances procedure, which is the new process for monitoring macroeconomic imbalances, and aside from the budget deficits and debt, which should be focused on competitiveness of essentially the peripheral countries, not dealing with surpluses. Banking union actually not needing a common deposit insurance, so basically stopping with the first pillar, which is a common single supervision. And in order to create more discipline and provide the right incentives for policymakers, is the end of risk-free status for sovereign debt. This, in this view here, would increase the market pressure, market discipline, and therefore help to member states policymakers to behave more responsibly. So more market discipline as the result of all this. So stronger fiscal rules, more market discipline, essentially the focus on risk reduction and not on risk sharing. So this is the first position. If you take the second one, hopefully it comes out. Here we are. So back to Maastricht is the first. The second one is, same if the title comes out. Here it is. So fast forward to a federalist economic and monetary union. Here, the focus on the aggregate fiscal stance. So the need to have a fiscal policy which complements monetary policy at the aggregate level. The macroeconomic imbalances procedure. So the MIP. Focused not only on deficit countries but also on surplus countries, so more symmetric adjustment, focus on full banking union to ensure financial stability, so having not only a common supervision but also the second pillar, so the a single resolution fund with an appropriate fiscal backstop, and the common deposit guarantee, and a fiscal capacity at the central level for risk sharing at the public for the budgets, and eventually sovereign debt mutualization as the long run solution. All this embedded in a euro area treasury, which is, let's say, the new institutions, and possibly Minister of Finance for the euro area. So the issue here is how to bridge between the German, let's say in inverted commas, the German view, which is the first column, and the let's say the French view, which is the second one. This debate is not new in Europe. We all know it's always between the two poles, and actually one of the problems that we have had over the past years and throughout the crisis is that the French pole has been far too weak, and the domination of the creditors, in particular Germany, has made these negotiations and this dialogue pretty unbalanced. So this is the task. So how do you go there? I think we need here, and that's what we try to articulate in the reflection paper published in spring, a new political synthesis where you would have, you would complete three unions, so the financial union, balancing risk sharing and risk reduction, so solidarity and responsibility, economic union with reforms, but also the proper incentives for that, and fiscal union with, yes, sound budget, but also a central fiscal capacity. So this is the, in very general terms, I mean, the architecture of a way forward which tries to, to bridge between the two positions that I have sketched out before. Now, looking at these three unions very briefly. So, financial union, objectively, I think this is the most urgent task to accomplish. So we are in the middle of the river with banking union. We have started the work on capital markets union. There's a lot to do there. So we need to complete the job here. I think for the stability of the Eurozone, thinking about the next crisis, which will certainly come at a certain point in the future, this is the most urgent task. So completing banking union and going forward in an effective way on capital markets union. So you can read here what needs to be done in the short term. So if one looks at next year, so summer 2018, I think we will need to have a banking union in place by then. So this is the task that we'll need, which is in front of us. And if one looks post 2019, I think there is the issue of introducing a euro area safe asset. It does not mean necessarily Eurobond. And that would have to could go hand in hand with a review of the regulatory treatment of the sovereign bonds. So if we review the regulatory treatment, making the sovereign bonds more risky, I think we need to have, for financial operator banks in particular, to have a safe asset which would allow to diversify their portfolio in an effective way. Why we need a financial union? I think you can. This is one of the let's say one of the indicators which show the difference between what is happening in Europe and the US and Canada. Basically here, what you can see is that we in Europe are overly reliant on bank financing, so the blue column, and we do not have enough capital markets developed in order to finance investment and to allow risk sharing. You can see the green bar on the top. So basically, we need the financial union because the blue bar is too long, and because the green bar is too short. So that's basically in a nutshell. And if one looks at, I don't have it here, but if you look at the indicators of risk sharing in developed, mature currency unions like the US, you can see that a lot of the risk sharing, and in the case of shocks, actually comes through the working of financial markets via portfolio reallocation and capital movements, which balance out the effect of the shocks. So I think moving in that direction, I think, is important for stability, risk diversification, and overall, so to support the recovery in an effective way and to boost potential growth and total factor productivity, because what we know for sure is because of general attitude and because the new regulatory system, the innovative investment that are needed in order to boost potential growth looking forward are not going to be financed by banks. Fiscal union, This is also dealt with in the reflection paper on deepening economic and monetary union. I think the key issues here are those indicated here. We need, I think, sound public finances, but also fiscal buffers, indispensable for a well-functioning monetary union, common stabilization tools at the euro area level. What we have experienced over the past several years is that it is virtually impossible to achieve let's say, an adequate fiscal stance at the euro area level simply in a bottom-up fashion by trying to combine national fiscal policies. It is impossible when countries do not want to do so, which are in a strong position, so the creditors, to constrain to do things that they don't want to do. So the experience here is that while markets can put pressure on debtors, they cannot put pressure on creditors, and creditors, if they do not want to use the fiscal space that they have, it is proving extremely difficult to force them to do so. So in order to achieve a fiscal stance which is adequate at the euro area level and complements the single monetary policy, one needs to have a fiscal stabilization tool, a fiscal capacity at the center. And this, I think, could go hand in hand with a review of, let's say, the conditions and for increasing the market discipline with simpler rules. What we have now is a set of rules of the Stability and Growth Pact, which have evolved into an extremely complex machinery. I think we can move in the direction of simplifying the rules by better combination of enforcement of the rules at the, let's say, at the central level, and more market discipline. So this a bit the kind of direction that we should go towards. Now, what I have tried to do here to motivate the, let's say, benefits of central stabilization capacity is to have a counterfactual exercise of what would have happened had we had a central, let's say, investment or stabilization capacity in the years 2012 and 2013. That's the years where we were in deep recession. So it was what we are looking for is not, let's say, an instrument for fine-tuning of the cycle, but an instrument which would complement the national fiscal policies and the national stabilizers at the center in order to increase demand when it's needed during these large shocks. And what you can see here, this is what the exercise that we have done with our model by simply taking making let's say a simulation with a multiplier of around 1, which I think for conditions prevailing 2012-2013, in our view, seem to be roughly right. Others would actually say that probably the multiplier was larger in that period there. But if you take even, let's say, a rather conservative multiplier of 1 with a balanced reduction of taxes and increase in spending, you can see that you would have reduced very substantially the output gap and reduced the unused capacity by in 2012 about 1.5 percentage points of fiscal expansion at the center, and in 2013 about half of that, so about 0.8. So this is the benefits that you would have had by had we had a central fiscal stabilization capacity at the time, which we did not have. If we then move to the next union, which is not very resilient, or at least excessively resilient, okay, economic union here. I think we need to have I think more, need to still continue to strengthen resilience, to, reduce divergences. I think we have to improve and make economic policy coordination more effective. And we have to review the way the EU budget is actually composed. So the distribution of the EU budget, which continues to be very much dealing with matters which are of the previous, let's say, the previous policy priorities, I think should be reoriented quite substantially. In particular, one could and should link the part of the funding of reforms to the EU budget in order to provide the right incentives and support countries also with technical assistance. So economic union, I think, can be certainly made more, made deeper. And what I try to do here is to simply to sketch out there in a conceptual way. I think the reduction in vulnerability and increase in adaptability. Basically, we have to increase resilience by, say, shifting the line to the left via the reforms that I mentioned earlier. If we move forward. Output legitimacy is important, but input legitimacy is important as well. I mean, it's not only by delivering on what one has promised, but also they'll say, ensuring that the process is democratically legitimate. That is important to regain the support of the citizens. Here, the proposal is to the ESM, so the European Stability Mechanism, to progressively graduate into a European Monetary Fund, firmly anchored to the European Union. We are going to come forward with a package of proposals in December, and the proposal there is to insert the ESM, which is currently an intergovernmental animal, into the EU, into the community institutions. By the way, I open and close a bracket immediately. Mario Draghi does not like the M in in European Monetary Fund because what he says is that there is only a monetary authority in Europe, that is the ECB. So unlike the IMF, which is actually financed by the reserves of the central banks, so legitimately you can dub it as International Monetary Fund. For Europe, that would not be the case because this is financed by the treasuries. So we are still exercising our imagination and try to see whether we can find a more compatible name. But in the general debate, everybody talks now of a European Monetary Fund, and eventually also the establishment of the European Minister of Economy and Finance, which will have these competencies that I have listed here, and increased also the accountability, so the input and throughput legitimacy vis-à-vis the European Parliament. I think this is the final slide, or a couple of slides. Okay, this is gone too far. Okay. I mentioned before that basically the European budget, the way it is now, with 50%, almost 50% still devoted to the common agricultural policy, is a relic of the past. This was actually, we used this term relic of the past in the Sapir report that we published in 2003. I think considering the desiderata of the society and the way the economy has evolved, it is even more of a relic now than it used to be at the time. So if you ask citizens, this is the Eurobarometer, one of the latest Eurobarometers, what are the most important issues facing the EU at the moment, this is the reply. And if you would map here this with the with the EU budget, you will see an almost inverse correlation. So basically, the EU budget does things which are completely different than what is requested right now. So a reorientation towards, let's say, new EU public goods is something that is needed in the future. So making a parallel progress towards deeper economic and monetary union on the one hand, and review of the priorities at the EU level and the EU budget in particular, I think seems to be politically the name of the game. So new European public goods, I have listed already what I mentioned before, so more further cooperation on terrorism and more broadly on security and defense. I think common policy on migration, progress has been done there, but we are still far from a common policy, and also from more economic viewpoint, boosting investment and deepening market integration. That's some of the things that are being done and will be done in the future. I think the conclusions is here, going back to what I discussed at the very beginning, so on the outcome of the elections. Okay, populists, I think, in check, but by certainly not yet defeated. So this populist pressure should not be underestimated. We have a chance now to relaunch Europe. I think we need a comprehensive package to bridge the different positions on economic and monetary union, but also to respond to citizens' requests in the first place. So creating bridges makes sense, because there is a part of truth on both sides of the columns that I presented before, those emphasizing, let's say, discipline, responsibility, risk reduction, and those emphasizing solidarity and risk sharing. The main goals: complete economic and monetary union, in premise as a first priority banking union, but also foster reforms to transform the current recovery into higher potential growth, deliver new European public goods. And here, I often conclude with this line here, which is we have to defeat the ultima ratio. And what we have done in the past years is to make reforms only under duress, when markets pushed us shoulder against the wall, and so we were under the ultima ratio mode of functioning. I think what we need to do is to exploit now the current recovery, which, as I said, is pretty robust. This is not in the genes of politicians, because the temptation is always let's wait for now. Things are going fine. No need to make bold moves. This is precisely what we should not do now. So defeating the ultima ratio is, I think, the utmost political challenge that we have in front of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I have a PowerPoint, which I assume will appear eventually, but thank you very much for that very elegant talk. I thought I should, as a commentator, this is Halloween, I should wear a Marine Le Pen mask, but I couldn't find one in time to do this, so you'll have to take me without so much humor. I received a couple of days ago a copy of Mr. Butti's comments, and they led me to look up ultima ratio, and I discovered, as I'm sure the Europeans in this room and a few others know, that, ultima ratio regium was what the French king, I think Louis XIV perhaps, had engraved on his cannons. So the last argument of the king, I guess, meaning the last resort, right? And so you've learned something already from me, even if you don't learn anything else the next 5 or 6 minutes. So it's a great pleasure to comment on this talk. And as background for it, I do recommend this reflection paper on deepening the EMU, in which I'm sure Mr. Butti had a hand. It's absolutely masterful in both economic and political terms, at a really interesting thing to read. In the brief time I have, I'm simply going to exploit my comparative advantage as a political scientist, although vis-a-vis EU politics, I doubt it's an advantage vis-a-vis Mr. Booty, to bring a few additional political perspectives to these issues, since strengthening the euro is as much a political as it is an economic project. And my comments can be seen as an invitation to Mr. Booty to comment on some of the political dimensions of the problems. I'm going to say a few words about electoral politics and then a few words about intergovernmental politics. And so in the realm of electoral politics, Mr. Booty is surely correct to identify rising support for populist parties as one of the principal threats to the European Union and certainly to further integration of the euro. And as these figures, which are from a recent CEPR report, indicate, support for populism is closely associated with distrust of the European Union. This is not news to any of us, but it's very apparent in this slide. And even when they don't win majorities, populist parties make further European integration difficult, either as components of governing coalitions, which they increasingly are, or as political threats to current governments. And the data show that current governments are moving, as political parties do, in the direction of right populist parties to cope with those threats. But as Mr. Booty observed, and this is his Eurobarometer diagram, there's good news here in that popular support for the euro has been consistently high throughout the economic fluctuations of the past few years. And to her chagrin, this probably played a major role in the defeat of Marine Le Pen in the last French election. Indeed, some hope that the current economic recovery in Europe, which is gathering steam, might take the wind out of the populist sails. But I think two important qualifications have to be made to this. First, estimations in this same CEPR report and elsewhere suggest that support for populism is not especially responsive to economic growth, at least over the short term. So we can't expect a cyclical recovery in Europe to suppress populism there. Robust German economic growth did nothing to prevent the Alternativen from securing 92 seats in the Bundestag a few weeks ago. So that's one qualification. A second might be this. Support for the EU is high but not monolithic across Europe. And as this slide, which is drawn from a recent article by Jeff Frieden and Chase Foster, indicates, over the past few years, support for the European Union, trust in this case in the European Union and its politicians, has fallen more dramatically in the debtor countries of Southern Europe than in the creditor countries of Northern Europe. And more important, I think, within the debtor countries, support has fallen the most among lower skilled workers with low paid jobs. And indeed, I think we would see something similar, although it doesn't come across quite so clearly in the north of Europe as well. So along with other kinds of data, this suggests that support for populism, this threat to the Eurozone and to the European Union itself, support for populism is not rooted simply, or maybe even mainly, in low rates of economic growth, but in the persistence and sometimes the deepening of economic inequality, including inequalities in life chances, in the security of employment, and also income inequalities. And if that is correct, I think this has some important implications for the future of the euro. Almost all of the proposals for improving the resilience of the euro, and we've heard some good ones here, are organized around the notion that the objective is to promote higher levels of growth and economic stability in Europe by enforcing structural reforms on laggard economies, in many cases, so as to make their markets more intensely competitive. And of course, there are some very good arguments for doing this, But one of the inevitable byproducts of this kind of structural reform is increasing economic inequality. And so you can see where I'm going with this. If populism is one of the principal dangers facing the European Union today, and if many of its roots lie in economic inequality, then those who seek to make the euro more stable should be thinking not only about structural reform, but how to offset the disproportionate costs that structural reform impose on certain groups of people. And as everyone here knows, that is exactly what was said for several decades about trade liberalization. Trade liberalization can generate aggregate gains, but it's socially just and politically sustainable only if there's some compensation for the losers. Of course, many Western governments didn't bother to take that advice seriously, and I worry that partly by virtue of the division of responsibilities in the European Union, those who are hoping to make monetary union more resilient are not thinking much about this side of the matter either. And moreover, the answers to this don't have to do with the dreaded transfer union that looms as a specter over the continent of Europe, but rather in reconsidering how national social policies like pension policies and unemployment insurance and the like are treated in the context of supposedly desirable structural reforms. So that takes me to the second political realm about which I want to say a few words, namely the realm of intergovernmental politics. So here the question, of course, is, among the many, this comes from the reflection paper, among the many desirable steps that might be taken to render the single currency more resilient, which ones are the likeliest to be politically feasible? And although I know Mr. Booty has to be somewhat reticent about this, I hope he'll offer a few views of his own, and I'm going to provide an opinion against which he can react. So as we all know, Europhiles have had a topsy-turvy year. My words are almost the same as yours. Euphoria after the victory of Emmanuel Macron in France has been followed by apprehension in the wake of a German election that is likely to see the FDP enter the governing coalition and perhaps take the finance ministry. And this is important, of course, because the Free Democrats campaigned against a transfer union, in favor of haircuts of the financial kind rather than the kind that I currently need, and in favor of a plan in which countries that run into trouble simply exit from the euro. So Britain's out. Macron is trying to pull the ignition switch on the Franco-German engine that used to power the European Union with or without emission controls. What happens when that vehicle starts up? What will become of the ambitious and very sane proposals to improve the operation of the euro that Mr. Booty has outlined? And I don't have time to provide much of a rationale, but here are, to conclude, here are my predictions. If this works. Right. First, I think President Macron will get the European Minister for Economy and Finance that he's seeking. But the role of that minister will be coordination. And we've heard from Mr. Booty why coordination is needed and desirable here. But I think Macron will not get the second part of his proposal, i.e. this minister will have no budget. And there's a good argument for this. There's a palpable need for more coordination among the disparate responsibilities now associated with the euro. And everyone, including Mrs. Merkel, knows that President Macron needs some victories. He's one of the few major figures in Europe taking the populists head on with a strong defense of the European Union. And a symbolic victory is better than no victory at all. So that's my first, perhaps incautious prediction. Second, although I'm less certain about this, and I'd like to hear Mr. Booty's views, I think progress can and will be made on a European capital market. This involves some difficult politics, but it takes place in the realm of producer group politics, and that's a realm that the European Union has always been particularly adept at. And I think Brexit provides some momentum for this as well. Moreover, European leaders understand that precisely because it's proving difficult to use public funds to improve risk sharing, there's a stronger case for improving risk sharing via funds in the private sector in the way that a European Capital Markets Union would do. Third, for similar reasons, I also see some prospect that the euro area might get a common deposit insurance scheme, provided it's paid for, or at least seems to be paid for, largely by the banks rather than governments. I'm myself not at all sure just how much such a scheme would actually contribute to accelerating cross-border lending, which I see as the sine qua non of the survival of the euro, by the way, but it wouldn't hurt. And finally, there's the intriguing question of whether in the next budgetary round, the allocation of European structural and investment funds can be tied more explicitly, more directly, to structural reforms. I mean, to some extent, they already notionally are. The question is whether this can extend to increasingly painful structural reforms. And on this, I'm cautiously optimistic. On the one hand, the East European governments that are some of the largest recipients of this kind of aid have drunk the Kool-Aid of neoliberalism. Many of them believe in structural reforms, and the EU provides a convenient excuse to implement some that are otherwise politically difficult. That may be less true in the southern European countries, but those countries have also moved a very long distance in the direction of structural reform over the last 7 or 8 years. And as the recent Council decision on posted workers indicates, the Franco-German engine is not entirely reluctant to steam over those countries that stand in the way of its will. So I hope these thoughts are sufficient to stimulate some discussion and maybe a response from Mr. Booty. Thanks very much.
So there's no need for a summary, but for a response, Marco.
Okay, no, thanks very much to Professor Hall. Thanks, Peter, for this stimulating discussion and for your prediction. I think you were more courageous to stick out your neck than me on this, but
I have less to lose.
You have less to lose, as you say. I was just about to say. Now, on the, I think, crisis of trust and the issue of populism, inequality, etc. I think, okay, first of all, and I mentioned like that a bit en passant during my presentation, populists of different sorts, they have, as I mentioned before, one thing in common: they are against the EU. They are essentially against the EU, which represents the, let's say, regional globalization. Why so? Those who are concerned about economic issues actually operate in the same marketplace of the EU. I mean, we are in. I mean, if you look at the competencies that the EU has now, it is essentially in opening markets, implementing competition policies. We are as direct responsibility of the EU in charge of trade policy, internal market, policing the budget, and ensuring that there is fiscal discipline. So we operate let's say in the marketplace of the populists, and the populists they precisely have a frontal confrontation with the EU. We have very little competence in the pre-market phase, which is the one where you create endowments, so human capital, so which reduces, let's say, it reduces inequalities by increasing opportunities in the first place. And if you jump over the market dimension, you go to the post-market, we have very little, if no competence at all, in smoothing the effect of the markets and implementing redistribution, welfare systems, and so on and so forth. So we operate in the same marketplace, and there is this frontal attack between of the populists against the EU. Those who take a cultural view, a more identitarian element, clearly they have the EU as the first, as the first target. We are in for protecting minorities. We operate through the filters of rules and institutions. And populists, what do? I mean, they are for the dictatorship of the majority. They want to cut out all the filters between the strong man and a woman and the citizens. So by operating, by Twitter, Twitter policy. So it is clear that in both cases, and sometimes there is a mix between the two, you have the populist against Europe. Now, inequality. I think, and here we are advancing the, let's say, the elaboration of structural reforms which are compared to those implemented during the crisis, which are, let's say, more equality friendly. So we have talked about structural reforms 2.0. I think we can, if one takes factors in the structural reform program, concerns about human capital, the opening up of product market regulations, I think, is equality friendly, not unfriendly. So I think you can especially in a situation in which you have growth being sufficiently robust, you can more easily compensate the loser. So I think we can have let's say a program of structural reforms which is not necessarily unequivocally increasing inequality as sometimes is perceived on that. Let me go quickly on your predictions. I think I agree on the fact that we would move forward on financial union, including on EDIS, so EDIS being the common deposit insurance. On that, we have made some proposals publishing a communication actually 2 weeks ago, for which we look at progress on deposit insurance, which is more gradual than in the initial proposal, starting with reinsurance and then co-insurance. So I think this has taken out a bit let's say some of the aversion that you have in countries like Germany towards that. EU budget tied up more to structural reforms. I think yes. Also, I think that's something that I have outlined as well. I mean, your first prediction is the most contentious one. So there will be let's say a Euro area minister or European Minister of Economy and Finance, but without the budget. Now, I think it will have a budget because if you use, let's say, if you have part of the EU budget linked to implementation of structural reforms, this would actually be under the responsibility of this figure here. I mean, the most critical issue is whether we would have a stabilization tool of the type that I have outlined there. So a fiscal capacity which is sufficiently sizable, even though not enormous. I mean, in the simulations that I provided there, for the 2012, which was the clearly the year of the deepest slump, we talked about 1.5% of GDP investment of fiscal capacity, so not a huge one, but clearly sizable. Now, I think the safe prediction is that we are not going to have that by June 2018. I think there will be the need of further reflections, a further debate on that. So we are talking about more to the horizon of 2025, so the medium term rather than in the very short term. I think that is it's not a prediction, but it's something that we'll have to continue to work on because as I indicated before, clearly the experience is that we cannot achieve, and I repeat what I said in my introduction, we cannot achieve an adequate fiscal stance for the Eurozone as a whole simply bottom up by aggregating the policies of the... Is there a way to convince the skeptics, so Germany, the Netherlands, Finland, that establishing a fiscal capacity is, I think, is rational and desirable also from their standpoint? I think one can have a number of reasons in that direction. Okay. First of all, they complain a lot, these countries complain a lot on the negative interest rate policy of the ECB and quantitative easing. One of the reasons why the ECB is pushed shoulder against the wall is that we do not have a sufficiently balanced policy mix. So should we, if we had a fiscal capacity, I think it would lessen certainly the pressure on the ECB. So that this is, I think, one argument. I think another argument is that you have more legitimacy to implement seriously the fiscal rules of the Stability Pact at the national level if you have the possibility to help countries at the central level. So more focus on in the implementation of the rules on sustainability and stability rather than stabilization if you have this complement here. These are, let's say, two reasons why one would see in a favorable way also from the point of view of the skeptics of establishing a fiscal capacity. A final one is that since we are thinking about a fiscal capacity and stabilization, which is, as I said, not for fine-tuning, but for responding to large shocks, this would be the final, let's say, filter before countries go to the European Stability Mechanism and with all the problems that we have. So it is an element of risk reduction also in order not to push countries in the hands of the ESM, which is, we know, it is extremely contentious always.
Thank you very much, Marco. You spoke of the French pole not being powerful enough since when? 2010? And the Northern European pole dominating. At the same time, you started showing that the European economy is growing strongly, broadly based. Portugal is doing nicely, Spain is recovering, no current account deficits all over the place. Wasn't this Northern politics very successful? Why complaining?
No, I said that the recovery is robust and broad-based. At the same time, we are at least 2 years behind the US, and I have shown you also with my diamond that we are still not there. So I think had we had a more balanced approach over the past several years in tackling the crisis, I think we would be in a better position now also from that viewpoint. We are clearly better now than we were 2, 3, 4 years ago, even last year. I think we have to try to exploit the opportunity now to complete the architecture by making the difficult choices which are, I think, needed.
Would these developments have happened without the conditions as they were written down in the adjustment programs? Would we have seen those reforms in labor markets in Italy, in Spain, without the Northerners?
That I think is a good point. Probably not fully, because we know that the ultima ratio that I mentioned before applies not only at the European level, also at the national level, and the adjustment and the reforms in a number of countries, those most in troubles, was actually imposed forcefully by the EU and IMF program. So I think that there is certainly an element of truth. At the same time, I think had we had had we made the right choices in terms of completing architecture of EMU, not as we have done being stuck in the middle of the river, but done that in previous years, I think that we would have confronted the crisis in a better, with better conditions, and possibly also with lower threats now of populist pressures.
I would like to open the floor to you. Who would like to come in? Vasilis.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Wood, for the presentation. I want to ask a question that follows pretty much one of the comments that Peter Hall made, but my focus is not so much the inequality as it is investment. And you mentioned investment in the beginning of your presentation, where you talk about the investment gap. So identifying the continuous investment gap in Europe. And then investment only came back at the very end as a third bullet point, almost to fill the slide, if you want, where FC, the Juncker plan, is also a bit of something that the European Union can do. And in the middle, there was, even though there is this understanding that structural reforms maybe don't always work, they create poverty, they create political problems, populist backlash, and things. It was always, the main message I understood is about fiscal discipline, structural reforms, and conditional on that, you get your fiscal ministry who can do a bit of redistribution, let's call it in the old kind of Willem Bouter terms, the common fiscal stance, so that it doesn't upset the Northerners as much. And I'm concerned that this continues, this kind of misunderstanding, misreading of the crisis as something which is basically a fiscal problem. Whereas we know it was a banking problem, and for very good reasons we tried to fix it with the banking union and capital markets union. And then it was a real economy problem because some countries were able to adjust, because they had an export base, because they had the capacity to diversify, because they had good domestic savings, investment rates, and some of the countries, including the country where I come from, Greece, they just couldn't. And they implemented all the reforms you wanted, but they didn't actually manage to get out of the crisis. Why? They have no exports, even though they did a fantastic current account adjustment, it's all down to imports. And in implementing austerity and being incapable of having a credibility to attract investment, they just, they had no investment, they had no demand. So essentially what we're saying is that you have to do structural reforms, and the market will come and solve the demand problem again. And I think the lessons that should come from the crisis is that we should have this kind of economy ministry rather than finance ministry, which worries about investment. And in some way, I think also this could help with the political, the intergovernmental politics problem, that it's easier to sell an investment ministry, I think, than a transfer union. So can you respond a bit where investment comes in and whether this should be something that the European minister should have?
Okay, no, thank you very much. I think it's good you put this question, because if if the feeling is that I did not put enough emphasis on investment, I think it's my fault in the presentation, not the reality on this. Okay, first of all, let me, on your very last point, when the President of the Commission, so Jean-Claude Juncker, in the State of the Union mid-September, talked about the progress in economic and monetary union, also in institutional terms, actually he talked about a European Minister for Economy and Finance. So it's not only someone who would police the implementation of the fiscal rules, actually a much broader portfolio, including on the structural reforms, but also on the investment side. So I think just to dispel any misunderstanding of this on this point. Now, on the FC, we have come forward with further proposals to strengthen that. Is actually FC, at the end of the day, in spite of the huge skepticism that we had at the very beginning, is actually delivering pretty well. It's 3/4 now into the delivery of what was promised in the first place, and is one of the reasons, by far, probably not the most important, but one of the reasons in the early revival of investment that we are seeing now in Europe. Now, when I talk about fiscal stabilization, and Peter recalled the reflection paper of the Commission on fiscal stabilization. Basically, there are two modus operandi and two options that we are considering. One is labor market based with let's say supplement of unemployment insurance at the of the national employment insurance at the European level, and the other one is operating via investment. So this is and I have to say between the two, it is more likely that we will go towards something which is investment based rather than let's say labor market based. Essentially because it is less ideologically charged than the previous one. So no, a lot of emphasis on investment, and I think this will be clearly the name of the game in the proposal that we are coming forward with.
Steve Cicchetti.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I have three categories of questions, Marco. I guess the first one is about deposit insurance. I was very pleased to hear you speak about it the way that you did, especially in the responses to Professor Hall. But I still would like to know if you think it's possible to have my understanding has been that the blockage has been that the countries that see themselves as being not the beneficiaries but the ones that are paying want the legacy problems of the banks to be solved first. And whether or not you feel that the program that you outlined can actually do that. The second question I have is about capital markets union. I agree it's extremely important for completing the financial and part of the union, but I've always wondered whether or not it was possible without legal harmonization, and to what extent you think that the legal systems across the euro area are going to be able to be harmonized sufficiently in order to support a capital markets union. And the third point is about this European Monetary Fund, or whatever it's going to be called after Mario Draghi finishes with it. When I've asked people about this, they say, well, you know, if you go to the ECOFIN, people who go to the ECOFIN say, if you go around the room, everybody wants a European Monetary Fund, but then you ask them what it is, and everyone's answer is different. So what is your answer? What is this animal? And what is it actually going to do? I know where it is. I've been to the building where the ESM is, but I don't know what the thing does.
Okay, thanks, Stephen, for these questions. I mean, on the first one, on the deposit insurance, I refer to the Commission communication that we published actually 2 weeks ago, mid-October, which tried to insert a bit of dynamism on the debate, which actually was pretty stuck on the EDIS, so on the common deposit insurance. So basically, what we have there is proposals on let's say 2 counts. On the one hand, as I mentioned before, we do not push immediately for going speedily to the common insurance where there would be responsibility for all the banks and for all deposits, but we look at the going through the reinsurance in the first phase and co-insurance in a second phase, with the proviso that you need to be, in order to move in that, you need to have reduced risks in the banking system quite substantially, in particular non-performing loans. So we make the progress in that, let's say, dependent on push on reduction of the risk, in particular non-performing loans. I think here, if one looks at the reduction of non-performing loans, I think the best environment for doing that is now with the strong recovery. And actually, if one looks also at countries like Italy, which is one of the countries finger pointed for having very large non-performing loans, and if you put together what comes out of the reduction of non-performing loans because of the improvement of the economic environment, plus the resolution of NPS, the Veneto banks, and others, I think by the end of the year, it is expected, and I quote by memory, that the non-performing loans will be reduced by 90 billion also. So there is it's dented quite a bit. So one has to keep pushing for tackling NPL in a decisive way, and this linking the move to progressive communitarization of deposit insurance, I think, is an additional incentives in order to do that. Now, on capital markets union, legal harmonization. Now, capital markets union is a completely different beast than banking union. It is a much more dispersed project, embracing many different actions. Eventually, I think to really achieve capital markets union, you probably need legal harmonization in a number of areas, and as well as and here probably Brexit provides an opportunity, some institutional counterpart, which would be the equivalent of the SSM that you have in the banking union in terms of supervision. So I think this is going to take quite a long time, and progress, I think, can be made, and eventual legal harmonization will be needed. But I think progress can be made in the meantime by progressively deepening capital markets union. Now, on the European Monetary Fund, what it would do, I think the debate is still open on this. We had the typical supporter of the EMF with Wolfgang Schäuble, has changed job lately. He was for actually giving very encompassing powers to the European Monetary Fund.
In particular, taking it away from you.
Taking it away from us, precisely. That was one of the intentions.
Did he have a reason?
No, he probably he thought that we implemented the fiscal rules in an excessively lax and flexible manner. I have to say that is highly disputable. I mean, if I look at, we are talking now of budget deficit in the euro area of around 1.5 percentage points of GDP. Way below what we have in other parts of the world, which have had a much better, a much quicker economic recovery. So, if one looks in terms of, I mentioned before, our output legitimacy, I think it's disputable that the rules were implemented in a lax way. Certainly, we implemented and we codified flexibility, and I think overall it was the right thing to do. I mean, actually pursuing even more than we have done austerity in bad times, I think would have deepened the economic slump even more. So going back to the European Monetary Fund, Schäuble had the view that it should indeed have more responsibility, not only in the case of program countries, but also in the case of, say, monitoring budgetary surveillance more generally. You have others who see and this is a bit the logic in the reflection paper that we published, it would be in a sense, the ESM moving towards a debt management office for the euro area. So, and eventually operating the fiscal stabilization and operating also the introduction of the safe asset when that would take place and will come in the future. I think we are going to have something in between the two. I think one can safely predict that the European Monetary Fund will have more responsibilities for, I think, design of the of programs. So when countries appeal to liquidity assistance, it will not have more responsibility for implementing the fiscal rules. What is interesting now, actually, and here, Hans Helmut, you may know, as you sure know better than me, but it is likely that the new Minister of Finance in Germany will come from the liberals, from the FDP.
Which will be great for Europe. An automatic sovereign debt restructuring.
So that is not going to happen either.
A temporary exit from the monetary union, so really stabilizing.
That is
putting some discipline into this.
Neither of that is going to happen. That I can put my hands in the fire. Now, one of the proposals amongst the outrageous one you just mentioned.
It's in the platform.
It is in the platform. It's not in the coalition agreement yet. So we'll have to see. But one of the proposals is actually to phase out the ESM from the liberals. So.
Which one should, because it's creating moral hazard?
It's creating moral hazard, exactly. So, I'm not sure that there is...
Well, it's not only them. I mean, the non-paper, which was tabled in Luxembourg.
No, but the non-paper, the author of the non-paper has changed job in the meantime, no?
Not yet. Ludger?
Who? Yeah. He is not the author. Other questions?
Was that a cry for help?
Okay.
So I have one question. Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask a broader question, given that, as Helmut mentioned, you were one of the authors of the white paper for the future of Europe. And so you mentioned populist movements as manifestations of a critique towards, or as main critique of the European Union. I would like to go back to some of the maybe old or new critiques that Europe is facing, and just to get your reaction on how can we address these. And so one of them is, it's partly linked to what Peter Paul said, but some of these are linked to, and I've heard that from EU officials, a lack of, say, leadership on the EU level, a strong leadership that will kind of provide a defense or counter-attack to populist movements. Macron, as you know, is now mired in some domestic issues that he needs to fix. A second one is this idea of competence creep. That is that, as you mentioned, EU has shared competencies with states in the domain of employment policies, but through the European framework, Europe has acquired more powers to kind of twist the arms of member states and implement structural reforms. So there's questioning around legal and political legitimacy of these processes. And then the third one is this idea that EU has failed to kind of deliver or has failed to implement its ideals, and I'm thinking here more specifically of EU citizenship and equality. And just to mention briefly some of the recent cases of the European Court of Justice, we now know that states can actually discriminate when they allocate welfare between their nationals and the third country EU nationals. So I just wanted to kind of get your sense about how do we tackle these very, very important issues if we want the European project to succeed.
Okay, you have many questions, too many.
Yes, you can.
I pick it on, but let me offer a reflection building a bit on what we said before in relation to the response to populist pressures. No? So the populist threats are there. I mean, they have not won outright political power in the past year in the several elections, but clearly the threats are there. Now, I've indicated before that one common element amongst the populists of the extreme left, the extreme right, but also in some of the extreme center, and we have seen it in some countries, is that they are very critical of the EU. And I mentioned before why that could be the case. Now, if this is the let's say the assessment, what is the right reply to this? Would one go towards more Europe or less Europe? I mean, if you consider that, as Peter mentioned before, that inequality is an important dimension, then you may want to have, let's say, more competencies at the Euro level also to deal with that problem there. For the moment, what we have is that we open markets, we implement competition policy, single markets, so we create inequalities and we let the inequality be dealt with at the national level. So it is national welfare states which would have to take care of inequalities, with very little that we can do at the European level. So if you take that entry point there, then the answer would be one would need to have more competence at the central level in order to tackle these issues. At the same time, and following up a bit on your introduction, this blurs the responsibilities between the EU and the member states. We operate then with the same competencies in a not very clear manner, and some say, okay, in order to create more transparency, more democratic legitimacy, in order to be clear on who is responsible for, one should distinguish actually more from what is done at the European level and what is done at the national level, and not complementing the two things and the two levels. I do not have a clear answer to this. The question is that what is a political equilibrium? I don't think myself that a political equilibrium is one in which at the European level you have essentially the harsh face and the harsh policies, leaving at the national level only the more lenient policies. I think here this is not something that is sustainable. I think myself in the long term. In the past, I mean, when I joined the Commission many years ago, we were there, and in a sense, it was our job to be the scapegoat for difficult policies that member states did not want to do. So they attributed the fault to Europe. We have to do it because Europe constrains us to do this, and the support for the European project was so high that even if you chipped away a little bit, it would still remain very high. I think now we cannot afford that, any longer. So I think the challenge here will be to increase transparency and to have a proper allocation of responsibility, so it is clear who does what and who is responsible for, whilst at the same time not leaving all the harsh, very difficult choices at the European level and all the, picking up the pieces and correcting the impact of those policies at the national level.
Okay. Yes, please.
Yes, Niels Bjørn, Copenhagen Business School. A little bit in the same direction, I wanted to ask about the question on the free movement of people, which is also, of course, a very important part of the economic union. So I think in the northern countries, and this also played a role in the debate on Brexit, questions on social dumping has been something that populists have debated very much, and which has given rise to populism. People coming from other countries, working for lower wages, taking jobs of working class people. This is how the argument goes anyway. Do you think that, how is there a European Union policy on this, and should there be a European initiative on preventing social dumping or is that something that the member states should do? Because I think it certainly gives rise in the northern countries in a way to populists. So I wonder if the European Union could step in here without sort of hindering the free movement of people.
Look, okay, first of all, I think this when one talks about the full freedom remains, and I think this is a centerpiece of European integration the way it is now. It will have to be in the future. So I think there is no compromise possible on that, and I think that's what we are trying to communicate also in the context of the Brexit debate to the UK. At the same time, I think there is some legitimate concern of that type. I mean, the latest decisions on the posted worker directives, I think, which somehow try to temper this type of concerns, I think is the right way forward. So one does not hinder the free movement of people, but at the same time, acknowledges that there is you need to have a number of rules which do not lead to allegation of social dumping. What has been achieved on the posted worker directives, I think, is something that is let's say a positive way forward, which marries the absolute preservation of freedom of movement with the need to take into account the allegation of social dumping.
Simon?
Thank you, first of all, for the very insightful and for the very insightful presentation and the discussion. I would like to address 2 points that you mentioned during your presentation, Mr. Butti, and the following discussion. You said that the macroeconomic environment in the Eurozone and in Europe has significantly improved, and that Europe actually switched from the recovery mode to expansion. And the second point that you addressed was that because the Eurozone lacks this comprehensive policy mix, the role of the European Central Bank has become increasingly important. And I would like to ask you something about the monetary policy of the European Central Bank, which decided just last week to continue its asset purchasing program, but on a lower scale. So continuing low interest rates and still having a very loose money supply in Europe. And my question is, as this also leads to distortion in markets and asset price inflation on the stock markets, on real estate markets, do you think that given the macroeconomic improvement in the Eurozone, that the European Central Bank should normalize its policies, or should those policies be continued in order to further support the macroeconomic improvements?
I think what the ECB decided last week is it's a very wise one. I mean, they hedged their bets clearly. I mean, acknowledging that there is the economic environment is improving, and I think President Draghi was very clear on that. At the same time, I think there are a number of uncertainties which remain, and what I try to present here are some of the indicators according to which the recovery is still not completed. It's still slack in the economy on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the delivery of price stability, which is the prime, the overriding objective for the ECB still not met. I think they have done very well. There was a risk of highlighted by some commentators of a taper tantrum that we had in the Fed. 2013.
May 24.
Which created quite a lot of turbulence in the global economy. This time, I think it has not been the case, and I think they have reduced QE, otherwise leaving the possibility to continue if needed after September. I think this seems to be a very wise And what we know for sure is that it is easier to, let's say, to temper and to reduce the degree of accommodation than to reverse policy in case you have gone too far, you have rescued it too early. And the experience of, I think, which has stinged the ECB quite a lot was the one of 2011, when they had two increase in interest rates in the moment in which actually the recovery was tumbling. So I think they have been vaccinated from that type of behavior, and now I think they play on being relatively risk averse, given on the global environment also, and the many risks that you have in the global economy. What you mentioned clearly calls into question the role of macroprudential policies. I mean, Stephen knows very well all these matters. So, to what extent macro-pru can be used in a more effective way in order to stem some of the consequences that you have on individual markets of ultra loose monetary policy. So that, I think, is the way one should look at and increase the effectiveness of macroprudential policies in order to achieve that.
Thank you very much, Marco. That was a very interesting presentation of the current landscape of discussions about how to make monetary union much more resilient. We learned a lot from the horse's mouth, if you like. Unfortunately, we're probably entitled to some skepticism with regard to the window, which is probably shut after the Berlin election. The new incoming government, if it's going to be that government, will be very difficult in terms of creating the environment you were suggesting to create. Unfortunately, and that's what you also said, Europe always needs a big crisis to get ahead. And maybe we'll get that one.
That's not the way to conclude. Okay, Hans Helmut, you get another chance to conclude in a more positive way. Okay, go ahead.
Marion heard me. That is straight out of Monet. Europe is the solution to the crisis. This is now not Monet, which produces itself.
It could have been worse. I thought you were going to say it's wonderful to have this presentation from Mr. Buti on from the horse's mouth, and then you were going to turn to the discussant and say, and a commentary from the horses, and then. Thanks for coming.
Sorry.